The circle of fifths. If you've ever taken a music class, then you've probably heard of the circle of fifths. So, what's the deal with this big scary music circle? In this video, I will help you understand it. But before we can get started, we first need to talk about and understand the major scale, because if you don't know what the major scale is, then you will not be able to understand the circle of fifths. A major scale is a group of 7 notes that follows a pattern of whole steps and half steps. Specifically, the pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. So, if you wanted to find C major, you simply start on the letter C and you apply the whole, half, whole, half pattern, which produces the 7 notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B. If you wanted to find G major, you follow the same pattern and you get the letters G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. Now, that last note is F sharp and not written as a G flat, and the reason for this is because in the major scale, one of the rules is that there can only be one of each letter, and there was already a G in the very beginning. This concept is called diatonic spelling. Another rule of the major scale is there is no mix of sharps or flats in a singular sequence. On top of that, you cannot have any double sharps or double flats. For instance, if you tried to spell out the hypothetical scale A sharp major, and you applied the whole step, half step pattern, and you only had one of each letter, it would produce a scale with 3 double sharped notes. A scale like that would be very hard to read for musicians, hence why it is one of the many banished major scales. Anyways, because of these rules, this whittles down the possible amount of major scales to 15. Now, when a piece of music is based off of a specific major scale, like E flat major, we would say that it is in the key of E flat major. A key tells us where our tonal center is and what scale we are working with. In standard notation, the amount of sharps or flats in a key is represented right by the clef on the staff. So, sticking with our E flat major example, the notes in this key would be E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, and D, if you abide by all of the rules of the major scale that we talked about so far. So that makes a total of 3 flats in this key. So by the treble clef, we would put 3 flats, and to be specific, we would put them on the lines or spaces that correspond with the notes that are actually being affected by the flats. This is called a key signature. And once you have a key signature, you no longer have to put the accidentals next to the notes in the scale, unless you use a note that's outside of the scale. So let's organize our 15 major scales by key signature. There are 7 major scales with sharps in the sequence, 7 major scales with flats, and 1 with no accidentals whatsoever. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of major keys and key signatures, we can now focus on the circle of fifths. You see, it's important to understand these topics first because the circle of fifths is actually a diagram of all 15 major keys. However, it is divided up into 12 spaces and not 15. Notice that the 3 at the bottom are in pairs. These pairs of keys, they sound exactly the same, they're just called different things. For instance, the key of B major and the key of C flat major, if you played them on your instrument, they will sound the same. But on paper, they would be labeled differently. Ultimately, even though that seems kind of pointless, there is a time and place for C flat major, and there is a time and place for B major. Anyways, the circle of fifths organizes all of the major keys by an ascending amount of sharps or flats. If you look at the right side of the circle, with every note that goes around, you add 1 sharp until you max out at 7 sharps, with the key of C sharp major. If you go around counterclockwise, you add flats with each letter until you max out at 7 flats with the key of C flat major. And the reason why it's called the circle of fifths is because every single one of these letters are separated by an interval of a perfect fifth. If you don't know what an interval is, I suggest you check out my videos on that, linked below. But a perfect fifth would be the distance between a root note in a major scale and its 5th scale degree. A perfect fifth is also equal to 7 half steps, or 7 frets if you play the guitar. So, starting from the top, C to G is a perfect fifth, and we know this because in the C major sequence, G is at the 5th spot. Going from there, G to D is also a perfect fifth. We know this because if you spell out the G major sequence, you'll see that D is in the fifth spot. Going from there, D major to A is a perfect fifth because if you spell out the D major sequence, you'll also find A in its fifth spot. So this general concept just repeats around the whole dang circle until we come back around to C again. As a side note, if you were to look at the circle counterclockwise, you would be descending in perfect fifths. C down to F is a perfect fifth, F down to B flat is a perfect fifth, and so on and so forth. Some people argue that if you look at it counterclockwise, it is going in perfect fourths. Well, technically you could argue that. I mean, you could technically argue that it's going in fourths clockwise too. I mean, it really just depends on what direction you're approaching the following note. Are you approaching it from up or down? I mean, the perfect fourth is the inverse of perfect fifth. At the end of the day, most musicians view this diagram as the circle of fifths because the interval of a perfect fifth is important in resolving chords as well as modulating to new keys. So that's the circle of fifths in a basic sense. However, there's still more to unpack with this thing. On the subject of sharps and flats, remember how I said it ascends in sharps on one side and flats on the other? Well, the circle can also reveal to us what notes are specifically sharped or flattened in the various keys. The secret to finding out what notes are sharped in a key is by starting on the F at the 11 o'clock position in the circle, and counting clockwise the amount of spaces equal to how many sharps there are in the key you're looking at. For instance, the key A major has 3 sharps. In order to find out what specific notes are sharped, we simply go to the letter F on the circle and we count 3 spaces clockwise, including the F. The letters F, C, G are the 3 that we counted. Lo and behold, these are in fact the 3 sharped notes of A major. In another example, let's look at F sharp major, which has 6 sharps. In order to find out the notes that are sharped, we simply start on that F at 11 o'clock and count a total of 6 spaces clockwise, including the F. This would reveal to us that the sharped notes in this key are F, C, G, D, A, and E. So that's the simple method that tells you the sharps in a key, and it is right there on the circle. And yes, with each successive sharp key on the right side, it assumes the previous key's sharps and adds 1 more each time. This overall concept is referred to as the order of sharps, the order in which notes get sharped in a key. And yes, there is an order of flats too. If you start on the B note at the 5 o'clock position and you count counterclockwise, you will reveal what notes need to be flattened in your key. For instance, if you wanted to know what notes are flattened in A flat major, which has 4 flats, simply start on the B and count a total of 4 spaces counterclockwise, including the B. This would reveal to us that B, E, A, and D are the flattened notes in A flat major. And yes, just like the order of sharps, with each successive key on the flat side of the circle, it assumes the previous key's flat notes and adds 1 more each time. So ultimately, if you can't remember what notes are supposed to be sharped or flattened in a specific major key, you can refer to the circle of fifths and it will show you. So we've covered a lot of basic concepts on the circle of fifths, but there is more to talk about. I mean, there is this inner circle, which I've totally ignored until now. It has all of the relative minor keys. A minor key is a tonality based off of the minor scale, and a minor scale is the major scale, but reoriented so that the root note is shifted to the 6th scale degree. So let's look at the key of C, which has C, D, E, F, G, A, B. Our 6th note in the sequence is the letter A. Now, if we take the same sequence of notes, same order, but start from the A instead, that would be the relative minor of C major, which is A minor. Let's try B flat major. If we were to spell it out, B flat, C, D, E flat, F, G, A, and we made the 6th degree, the G, the starting point, but we keep the same sequence of notes, that would be our relative minor, G minor. So on the circle of fifths, in that inner circle is the relative minor to each respective major key on the outer circle. The bottom 3 tonalities also have enharmonic pairings of their own in the minor section. Because these minor keys use the same notes as their major counterparts, they also share the same number of respective sharps or flats. So yes, D flat major has 5 flats, and so does its relative minor, B flat minor. Another thing the circle of fifths reveals to us is the relationship between keys. The closer 2 keys are on the circle, the more notes and chords they have in common. Like for instance, F and C major sit right next to each other and ultimately have 6 notes in common, as well as 4 chords. This creates a flexibility between the two keys, and it makes a possible key change between the two more seamless. Meanwhile, if two keys are distant, then they'll sound way less related. They'll have fewer notes in common, and perhaps not even a single chord. Key changes between distant keys is a little harder to pull off in a non-jarring way. Check out my previous video on key modulations to learn a little more about that subject. Another interesting thing to point out is the two letters bookending a specific note on the circle of fifths are the 4 and 5 chords of that note. Looking at the C at the very top, it is bookended by an F and a G. Well, in the key of C major, if you were not only to spell out the notes of the scale, but the chords too, you will see that the F is the 4 chord and the G is the 5 chord. And a 1-4-5 type of progression always sounds really satisfying. So yes, anywhere you go on the circle, if you look at the two neighboring letters, those will be your 4 and 5 chords respectively. Also, if you play the major chords on the circle in order, in either direction, it will result in a very smooth and satisfying progression. If you jump from a major chord to another major chord on the opposite side of the circle, it will sound a little bit more disruptive. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it will stand out a little bit more starkly to the listener. The circle of fifths is the ultimate reference tool for musicians of any skill level. It shows us all of the different major and minor keys and how they're related to each other. It also shows us how certain chords function with one another. You see, the circle of fifths reveals to us the very mathematical nature of music, and I think that's a really cool thing. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to hit subscribe so you can see more videos like this. I'll see you in the next one.